June the 6th, 2016. Guys, they're starting a drill tomorrow that many of you, especially on the West Coast, are aware of. It's going to involve about 20,000, I think, police and military personnel, including National Guard. But it's called CASCADIA Rising, and they're talking about the Cascadia Fault Zone. We've covered it throughout this year. It says a massive 4-day earthquake drill kicks off Tuesday in the Pacific Northwest. The region is ripe for what officials say could be the biggest natural disaster the nation has ever seen. The exercise, called Cascadia Rising, will test the readiness of responders at all levels of government. Let me interject something here just a moment, so that no one is deceived. I'm not saying this is a false flag to set up any type of military occupation or anything like that. But what I do want to say is this. When we see things like the non-government response worldwide for Fukushima that's destroying the Pacific Ocean and many other parts of the planet after the eruption, because all of that radiation was released into the atmosphere and it traveled around the world several times. It was a world-affecting event. My point is this. If you think these governments care about you, you're being deceived, my friend. Think about it. The rivers in that area, some of them, you've got some of the worst polluted as far as radiation in the world because of these big disposal plants. We've talked about those up there. We see oil spills. We see things like the tar sands in Alberta. And what we don't see is dozens of other oil spills around this nation. We see no response from our government. We see massive war. Do you think they really care enough to put the money to put 20,000 personnel on staff for your health? Think about it. Let me continue. It says the scenario is the worst case, magnitude 9 earthquake due to a full rupture of the fault line beneath the shifting tectonic plates of the West Coast Cascadia subduction zone, which extends nearly 700 miles from British Columbia to Northern California. Now, guys, one thing I want you to remember, most of the quakes that we've seen this year, and usually in the 4 range, have been at the north and south ends, not in the middle. And these are the break points. So some pressure's been released. Said this could be 5 minutes of, there could be 5 minutes of severe shaking on the coast. And this is from Scott Zaffram, a lead exercise planner with FEMA. And it's the local region number 10 office. So just listen and read between the lines. I'm not saying they're planning a FEMA camp drill or FEMA camp. Let me say this, not planning to put anybody in FEMA camps, but the exercise would be more in controlling the populace by these personnel to a FEMA location for whatever reason. But if you think it's to save your life, you're sadly mistaken. I have to put it in there, guys. I got to call it like I see it. It says, where you know it's pulling down shelves in the grocery stores, you've got movement on the ground, perhaps road splits, landslides, hazardous oil spills, flooding. It says then you're going to have 15 to 20 minutes after the earthquake, and a tsunami will be approaching the coast with waves ranging from 20 to 80 feet. We know for this scenario, the tsunami is where most of our fatalities are probably going to originate. They expect 10,000 to 13,000 people will be killed. And if it sounds low to you, it does to me too, this estimate, because you've got 700 miles of the West Coast. And it's not just within the 700-mile boundary of that Cascadia Fault, the main line that runs parallel with the coastline, guys. This thing is going to range out left and right. California, the 7th largest economy on the planet? A lot of folks to do that, a lot of taxes. Now, again, read between the words on this because it has a double meaning. Authorities agree that one of the biggest challenges will be communication across multiple jurisdictions. That's why planners from all levels of government in 3 states, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, as well as British Columbia, are taking part. They want to test the current plans and find areas for improvement. And this is from Karina Sagrin with the Washington State Military Department. Now, I guess California has had separate drills, and we know they have, like the big shakeout and things like that, so their preparation is in place. But California, you dead in the path of this thing. You know, because the bottom of the Cascadia Fault Zone comes right into the Northern California border. We've seen it many times. And let's go on in quotation marks from Miss Karina. We're trying to make this as real life as possible. And she says, for instance, in our State Emergency Ops Center, we will be bringing in state agency partners. It's going to be overflowing with people, and they will be testing their ability to communicate with our local jurisdictions, our federal partners, in an environment where communication systems are down. And that's correct, because you're going to disrupt power, and it could be for weeks or months when you have something of this magnitude tearing down light lines, destroying underground electricity, cell towers, things like that. So, and what they're doing, and I've talked about this for 4 years, ham radios, and of course satellite phones as backup. So what you'll see in all of the local jurisdictions, of course, they already have the ham radio systems set up in the shortwaves and communication systems and the sat phones. Because regardless of what happens on the earth with a sat phone, you could probably still get through without major disruption from solar flares or something like that. It says at the same time, the National Guard will conduct military field exercises. So you guys don't freak out over there. Testing everything from search and rescue to supply delivery and decontamination procedures. Guys, this is a perfect thing for them to do. My only thought was what I said at first. Is it really about saving your life or controlling your life? In total, about 20,000 people are involved in the Cascadia Rising exercise. It will start in the morning, Tuesday the 7th, and go through Friday. So you've got 4 days. Now, they've got legitimate reasons for watching this area and for preparing for what they need to do. Because what's happened, guys, and it's been going on for several years, is that where the big one, what they call this, originates is eerily quiet. And that's the long line that's 700 miles up the west coast. But again, remember I mentioned that we have most of the quakes at the very bottom, at the top of California. It says the fault zone expected to generate the big one lies underwater between 40 and 80 miles offshore of the Pacific Northwest coastline. And that's how much it varies from the fault and to the coast. But remember, 700 miles. Earthquake scientists have listening posts along the coast from Vancouver Island to Northern California. But those onshore seismometers have detected few signs of the grinding and slipping you would expect to see as one tectonic plate dies beneath another, with the exception of the junctions on the north and south ends of what is formerly known as the Cascadia subduction zone. That's what I'm talking about. The ends of it are taking the pressure. And it's been a long time, and we'll get into that. But remember, that long 700-mile straight line is the pressure point, and that's where the big one has occurred and will again, according to seismologists. It says it's a puzzle, according to the University of Oregon geophysics professor Doug Tumay. What is extraordinary is that all of Cascadia is quiet. Guys, the quiet before the storm. It's an extraordinary quiet when you compare it to other subduction zones globally. To make sure they're not missing something, researchers have been using ships to drop off and later retrieve ocean bottom seismographs. These record for up to a year right up on top of the fault zone. So they have the normal ones in place. They're getting these dropped, and now, and this has been going on for a few years, but a joint Japanese-Canadian team dropped instruments offshore of Vancouver Island. A separate team, and this is important, these separate teams, because that way the data from one of them being faulty won't throw the entire test and the results off. It says a separate team led by Tumay at the University of Oregon is in its 4th year of deployments, named the CASCADIA Initiative. It is rotating among subduction zone segments offshore Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. He goes on to say that even with more sensitive instruments, it's still eerily quiet, which leads to the researchers to conclude the dangerous Cascadia fault zone is stuck, or in technical speak, it is fully locked. The lack of interplate seismicity is interpreted to reflect complete healing and locking of the mega thrust over 3 centuries after the previous great quake. The evidence pointing to the colliding tectonic plates being completely stuck has serious implications for earthquake risk on land in the Pacific Northwest, and of course the tsunamis. Guys, and they're saying that it's locked not only at the stress point, but all the way inshore at other various faults and small faults. It says if there were even low levels of offshore seismicity, then we would say some strain is being released from the smaller events. If it is completely locked, it means it is increasingly storing energy, and that has to be released at some point. He said the big unknown is how much strain has accumulated since the plate boundary seized up, and secondarily, how much more strain can build up before the fault rips and unleashes a possible magnitude 9.0 megaquake and tsunami. Now, he goes on to say that he's very concerned, and it's imperative people in the Northwest continue to prepare for a big quake. And if you remember in a previous video, we talked about 6 miles of inward land being in dire straits there, guys, and that's one of the big highways that run up in there. But what was even more concerning was when you have the bays and the inlets that go far inland, you create a funnel effect. You're talking about cities and small towns, but a funneling effect that goes much further inland, as in it funnels, the wave height increases. So just check that out. Be aware of it. It says complicating assessments of the seismic hazard is the relative recent discovery of slow slip events deeper down along the plate boundary, that is, under the landmass of western Oregon, western Washington, and southwestern British Columbia. These slow-moving, barely detectable events may relieve or redistribute some of the stress building up in the locked portion of the earthquake fault zone. But guys, sometimes that area can have strong quakes, but they're not large now. He says the last full rip of the Cascadia subduction zone happened in January of 1700. The exact date and destructive power was determined from buried forest along the Pacific Northwest coast and an orphan tsunami that washed ashore in Japan. They had large problems there too. Geologists digging in coastal marshes and offshore canyon bottoms have also found evidence of earlier great quakes and tsunamis. The inferred timeline of those events give a recurrence interval between Cascadia megaquakes of roughly 400 to 600 years. And I want to say this. We've talked about the weather being strange and a lot of volcanoes going off, a lot of strong quakes. Now, for the first time that I can remember, we've had 3 days of what's called a spotless sun. That hasn't happened for years, guys. The 4th, 5th, and 6th, no sunspots on the surface of the sun. Now, what that means is that you're going into a solar minimum. We talked about that. We talked about a mini ice age. And we've talked about this also. When you have few sunspots and you're going into solar minimum, the wind speed affecting our planet slows down, or the solar wind stream. And scientists have found, it's been proven, that as that solar wind stream lessens and becomes weaker, the energy that it creates, called our magnetopause, which is all generated from this energy coming from the sun, and our ionosphere, everything weakens. In other words, our shields are weaker, so that if we do have a powerful solar flare, coronal mass ejection, With weakened shields, it will be a greater effect on our tectonic plates and causing more quakes. So you've kind of got a plus on one hand and a minus. Now, the temperature doesn't feel much like a solar minimum. The last couple of days, I told you I had to go down now this weekend and secure a boat, and we moved it, and I got a couple pictures that I'll share with you in the next video from there of how the weather was down there. It rained really hard last night, but now that storm is going to move further south from where I was in the Pensacola-Perdido area, and you guys south of there, between there and Tampa, heads up, watch all of it. You know you've got a tropical storm Colin there now, so watch it. Be prepared for not a terrible hurricane, but a tremendous amount of rain. We had that as the storm spun up over our area this weekend. High winds, a lot of rain overnight, both nights on the boat. It did cool it down in that area, but it was a sign of things to come. So even with the tropical storm, you can have trees down on light lines, flooded roads, and when you have trees down on light lines, guys, you could affect your ability to move, and also get your food and water. Emergency radio with batteries is good, emergency lights, things like that. Charge your cell phones up, because it's going to come ashore, and there's going to be some repercussions. But we're watching it. It's a heads up. Be safe.